Great, thank you. So we got a lot of experts in the room. So this will all be very familiar stuff. So a little bit more about me and kind of to orient you a little bit around the Family Development Center and who we are. So there's kind of two parts to the Family Development Center. There's the outpatient mental health clinic, and we see individuals, families, children, and our specialty really is around perinatal mental health, transition to parenthood, and all of that kind of encompasses. We're also generalists, so we see couples and we do a lot of play therapy and everything else. And then we really kind of recognized quickly that we were seeing primarily white middle-class women. And while there's nothing wrong with that, we know that they're not the only ones suffering. And so we started to dig into why that was. And we learned to no surprise to any of us that there are huge barriers to communities of color and low-income individuals accessing mental health care. And they are primarily based on research, transportation, lack of childcare, and lack of individuals providing the care that reflect the lived experience of those that are trying to find the service. So what we did was we created a program called Equal Footing. In that program, we started an in-home home visiting program to also address the transportation childcare issue. So one way we do that is ARMS, which all of you will be very familiar with. We also do offer some in-home sliding scale to try and address the undocumented population and groups that are like teenage pregnancy, so that don't meet the criteria for over 18. And then we also have a teaching clinic, and this teaching clinic is focused on recruiting and training therapists of color. And so that's ways that we do that is we go into high schools, we go into community colleges to talk about the field of mental health, as well as we have an internship program that is focused on training therapists of color into doing this work, because we have found, and we'll get into this a little bit here, that there is huge historical context of primarily white women going into the homes of African-American families, Native families, and telling them they're doing everything wrong and taking their children, and there's a lot of racialized trauma around that, and it persists. And so obviously I was here for part of that conversation, as one of the goals that you're trying to address is how to do that differently. And so we are too, because it is a barrier to people getting the services they need. So that's a little bit about who we are and the work that we're doing. Oh, maybe I did need help. Maybe I'll do it this way. Oh, good. So we're going to start and talk first a little bit about perinatal mental health. So the research says about 80% of new parents experience normal baby blues in the first weeks after the baby arrives. Do we have parents in the room? Okay. So yeah, well, I saw you kind of do this, but men do develop postpartum depression. So that's a really important thing to note, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Postpartum depression is the most common perinatal complication, and the numbers that are often talked about or named are numbers that are based on white middle-class women. The numbers for women of color are closer to 30 to 40%, and we will talk later about why that is, because a lot of that has to do with risk factors, and the risk factors impact women of color more, and that has to do a lot with systemic racism. it is life-threatening. Perinatal mood disorders, particularly perinatal depression, is life-threatening. Maternal suicide exceeds hemorrhage and hypertensive disorders as the leading cause of maternal mortality. So it needs to be taken seriously, and because of patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, people often kind of assume that like people get pregnant, women have babies all the time, get over it, do what, like everything's fine. Having children has a huge impact on first the human body. It takes an entire year just for a person's organs to go back to where they belong after pregnancy. It is a huge impact on the human body, on the emotional experience. And so attention needs to be paid. So I want to spend a little bit of time on racism and the impact of that on perinatal mental health. And some of this will be familiar because we've been hearing more and more about this, thank goodness, in the news. African American women cannot buy or educate their way out of dying. African American women die at 3 to 4 times the rate of white mothers in childbirth. And what that means is when they controlled for education, status, financial status, and all of those other variables, that did not protect African American women from dying. And so what that means is when they control for the variables, the reason for it is racism, is implicit bias. That is why African American women are dying. 9 months of prenatal care cannot counter underlying social determinants of health inequities in housing, political participation, education, food, environmental conditions, and economic security, all of which have racism as their root cause. It's also important to note that, and it's less reported, that Native American women also have similar statistics. It's reported less just because the population is smaller, but is equally as important. This is also true in infant mortality. So in 2015, mortality rates for American Indian and Alaskan Native babies under the age of 1 was 8.3 per 1,000 births versus white non-Hispanic babies at 4.9 deaths per 1,000 births. And mortality rates declined for infants of all races except for American Indian babies. Any thoughts about any of this? Any of this surprising? Any of this new information? Yeah. So I start with those slides because it's important to kind of orient ourselves to, as we talk to about perinatal mood disorders, that there's a context, that we're working within a context that when working with a person, you can't work with them without working with the context from which they're coming from. And when you're working with families of color, people of color, they are always coming from a context of racism and the intersections of, the women of color. It's gender, race, so it's important that we're always holding all the parts because that impacts mental health. So perinatal mood disorders can begin anytime during or after pregnancy. So oftentimes people just assume it's after the baby is born, but it can begin during pregnancy as well. That's why they're called perinatal. It can also happen even there's a miscarriage. So it's important to be checking into if someone you're working with has a miscarriage to continue to assess their mental health as well. It might merge with baby blues, or it can start later. So they may seem fine. They have like kind of the baby blues, and then seem to be doing a little bit better, and then start to kind of start to feel worse again. And a lot of times that has to do with the return to work. I see a lot of people around the time that they are going back to work. And usually it's around needing to wean, or the pressure of trying to figure out how am I going to breastfeed, or being away from baby, or starting birth control again. Those are all kind of reasons that it might be starting later. Any questions or experiences or anything anyone wants to speak to? So some of the etiology. So there can be a genetic predisposition. So when you're working with someone and they're pregnant or just had a baby, whenever you kind of start to come into their life, it's really important to ask about, well, what do you know about your mom's pregnancies, or what it was like for your mom after she had her babies, or sister, or aunt, or any sort of person in their life. What was it like when you've been on birth control? What are your periods like? Do you kind of fluctuate? Do you have big mood changes? That can give you some indication of maybe what could happen postpartum for them or during pregnancy. We'll get more into psychosocial factors, but inadequate support. People who kind of have a sense of needing to be perfect, or I can do everything. We see a lot of that, or I have seen a lot of that when working with moms who are single parents, and they have had to develop parts of themselves that have to do everything because they have to do everything. And so they need to kind of be a superhero. An additional stressor, so sleep disruption, which obviously there's going to be a lack of sleep, and lack of sleep is we don't want to kind of just write it off of like, oh yeah, early kind of times with babies are so hard, you're not going to get a lot of sleep. We need to figure out anything we can do to support the parent to get sleep, because sleep will perpetuate any sort of mental health challenge. The parent needs to sleep. Do whatever we can to make sure they're sleeping. Poor nutrition, any health challenges, and then interpersonal stress, cultural stress and barriers. So lots of stressors and risk factors. These will all be very familiar to you. And you will read these and be like, oh my gosh, everybody we work with could develop a perinatal disorder. So absence of social support structure. So important questions are, so who's in your network? Who are the people that you can rely on? And so one thing that's important to kind of help identify is if they have a parent that is really critical, then maybe that's not the person you're going to go to when you're needing kind of emotional support. Who's your emotional support person? But maybe that parent is really good at kind of getting tasky things done. So helping them kind of figure out who the right people are to go to for the certain things. Complicated pregnancy and delivery. Yeah. Unwanted pregnancy, infertility issues, single parents, low income pregnant people, recent immigrants. Are these people that have been on your caseload or come to your organizations? Yeah, all of them, right? Yes. So here are some more risk factors. So unsupported or interpersonal stress, domestic violence, poor relationship with one's own mom, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Ambivalence about the maternal role. So that's something that's not talked about enough. So you may have someone that wasn't sure about, that maybe had an unwanted pregnancy. You might also have someone that really wanted to be a parent and then became a parent and then developed a lot of ambivalence around that and then feels a lot of shame about it. And it is so important to be able to say, that's okay. Like, you're not alone. That's not an uncommon experience. We can talk about that here. Like, you get to say that stuff out loud. Because parenting and like, for parents in the room or aunts and uncles or whatever, parenting can really suck. Like, it is really hard. It is so hard. And it is activating and exhausting. And so, and then everyone is always telling you like how wonderful this is.
The greatest experience of your life.
And you're like, no, this is actually terrible. And so there's a lot of mixed up feelings, and you can help them kind of not feel so mixed up by validating that it's okay if you feel mixed up. Lots of people do.
And really that whole question about your social support is so extremely important.
Yes.
It is, I guess, no question, but really tell me more about your social support. Because even if you're in a solid partnership, you know, you have a partner. If your social support is only dependent upon that partner, I was just reacting how when you talked about postpartum depression. I mean, because men experience that too.
That's right.
They really don't know how to handle someone who is going through that. So that negative energy just transfers and it cycles into something that neither partner knows how to.
That's exactly right.
I know my husband told me he couldn't stand to be around me. And I don't blame him.
Yeah.
It's probably
right.
a horrible experience. And so that social support, that network has to be a whole lot
Deep and wide.
Yeah.
It has to be
Deep
wide.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good point. Deep and wide, and knowing, and attention is so often paid just to the woman, and not to the man in kind of when the babies are first born. But then there's also what happens, and this could be like a whole other training, but around gender roles. And so how we are socialized typically is that a baby is born and all the work goes to the woman and the man's kind of on the side, and then immediately resentment starts to build, and then that impacts the relationship, and they start to feel more disconnected, and so now there's like relational issues and lack of identity for the woman. So whenever I'm working with couples, I often tell them, I said, you know, when the first child is born, the life changes the most for the woman. When the second baby is born, the life changes the most for the man, because then he finally has experiences what it was like for her when the first baby was born. Because when the first baby is born, and this is just how we're socialized, like life kind of just keeps going. Like he just continues to do what he's always done. And I'm generalizing. But then when the second baby comes, then things change for him too. But it's really hard to get them to see that. And there's a lot of hurt feelings in the meantime. And then it's really hard to have the conversation about gender roles and everything else. But
The thing about social supports,
mhm.
I had babies long ago, but I had a mom, grandmas, and 5 sisters, so I thought I had good social support. They were telling me what to do all the time.
Yeah.
And so social support can be helpful, not helpful.
Yes.
That was for me just so overwhelming because everybody had their opinion about what I should and shouldn't be doing. So
Yeah.
I think social support isn't enough unless it's
Yeah.
really listening to the mom.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point because there's a culture, and we can get into this a little bit around breastfeeding of, there's certain good ways to do things and not good ways to do things. And there's a hierarchy, very much like, a unmedicated vaginal birth is like here, right?
Yeah.
And then and anything other than that is like you kind of start to go down here, and women develop lots of shame around that. And then breastfeeding for 1 year is here and longer than you're way up here. And so if you don't do that, then you're not a good mom. And the amount of shame, anxiety, overwhelm, lack of sleep that I see from women coming in because their baby won't latch, because they can't breastfeed, because of on and on and on is unbelievable. So I put a website resource called Fed is Best on here because that should be where you center and help parents center is around Fed is Best. So if I had more time, we could get into that because that the pressure that parents feel around breastfeeding, and I support breastfeeding if it is not impacting mental health, if it is not impacting mental health, and if it's not impacting mental health. So, and then I think we just have, what I'm thinking about, you guys, is we have 35 minutes and so much stuff. And so I want to make sure that I'm going to attend to what feels the most helpful to you. And so I have stuff around parent-child kind of information, and I have symptoms stuff for perinatal mood disorders, and then I had kind of your own how to do how to center yourself. And so I just want to make sure that we can do this in a way that feels the most helpful to what you're needing. And
Speak up if you have a preference for one of those 3 sections.
Yeah.
Start there.
because I'm aware that
Delta, I think this is Laura for those of you who are on I'll speak loud.
Yeah.
For those of you who are on Zoom, I think what's most helpful is when you think about as a supervisor
Mhm.
and you're supporting your staff.
yeah,
What are the things that you've seen in helping, because you provide consultation to
Mhm.
folks? How do you help them manage through, whether it's a symptom or maybe touching on some of those
Yeah.
things, some really tricks that you found or tips that you found helpful? And then I just really quickly just want to share, Brittany is online with us, and she is back first day of work after having her first baby. So,
Ah.
she's texting me like, this is so helpful.
Good.
Those of us who do the work are also impacted by this.
Yes,
So, anyway,
which is
it's just,
one of the
I
things
asked
to get
permission
to.
share, and she's
Yes.
like,
Um,
all right.
So, I think what I'll try and do, because like you can read through these things, so I don't need to like go through kind of symptoms, if that's okay. So things that are really important to remember, that perinatal mood disorders are common, but they're frequently undetected. But if you detect them early, so if you're curious and you're kind of tracking and you're non-judgmental, so kind of to your point about like, how can I help be supportive in a way that is not about me and like what I think is best, you can help people get better. So protective measures that can help a pregnant person can greatly reduce their suffering. And so that's helping them before the symptoms get worse. Key to recovery is early identification of risk. And so you're coming into working with these families and they already have a lot of risk. So that's helping them kind of identify who are their support people and what are these certain support people good at. And so again, not hooking up the judgmental sister, right? But unless that judgmental sister is really good at getting things done, then you go to that sister to help like clean the house or, you know, do things like that, but not for emotional support. Cultural competency and sensitivity is essential. And then psychoeducation, how important it is to normalize and to give them some context to what's happening, to let them know that it will get better and that they can get better, and that it doesn't mean anything about their attachment to their baby. And then planning around what they need to do. So these are some, because one of the questions was, how do I talk with clients who are resistant to medication? And so these are some resources around the impact of depression on attachment. And so what can be really helpful is if you have actual information for them of, so medication can be scary and it doesn't have to be forever. You don't always have to take medication. Sometimes people just take medication for just a small period of time. But here's what we know about the impact of a depressed parent on attaching to your baby. And I know how important it is for you to attach and connect to your baby. And you would do anything to like have a healthy attachment. And so here's what we know. So that's one way that you can kind of have a conversation, and it's backed up by research, and you can look at that with your clients. You can share this information with them. And then there's also resources that give information on medication and different types of medication you can take during pregnancy and postpartum, that you can share with your clients as well, that give kind of like, here's the impact, here's, you know, concerns that people have, and you can look at that together. And this is the Fed is Best. And they have a lot of great resources on that website also.
It is on the website.
Look,
There's a meeting
I can
folder.
say- Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's just like a read.
Yep,
Okay.
there are copies on the website.
Okay, thanks.
And so what I am always encouraging my people that I have supervised or the interns who are new to perinatal mental health, what I'm encouraging them to always kind of look for and assess for is, again, because in our culture we kind of minimize birth and pregnancy because it happens all the time and everything else, we are not holding what an enormous experience it is. And so I don't know for some of the women in the room, but for a lot of women, and if anyone wants to speak to this, they can, you didn't think about giving birth like for the first time on the way to the hospital. Like you started learning about, being pregnant, maybe putting a pillow under your shirt, imagining what you'd look like kind of young. And then you started like being curious about what that would be like and how that would go. And so like pregnancy and birth for a lot of women is something that you imagine and think about and wonder about. And do I want to be a mom? Do I not want to? What kind of birth do I want to have? What are my options for a really long time? And then there's a lot of expectation around it. And then you get pregnant and then everybody asks you about your birth plan. And so there's all this buildup. And so when it doesn't go the way that you expect, it is utterly overwhelming. And then when it is scary, and for a lot of people, the first time you give birth, no matter how well it goes, it's still pretty scary. You can feel helpless, you can feel overwhelmed, but then you're told that like, it's fine, you're fine. You don't get to, and depending, you don't get to make a lot of decisions. You're told what to do. People can be mean to you. And so it can lead to trauma, and it is very common. Ask about birth. Ask about what it was like. And be open to what they say because trauma is in the eye of the beholder. So you might have a feeling of like, well, that seems okay. But be curious because it could be traumatic to them even though it might not land for you. And it's also important to know that there is greater rates of birth trauma for women of color than for white women, which of course is, no surprise here. And then there's a lot of shame too, because if a person went in with the intention of not having interventions and then ended up having a lot, then they feel like they failed, and then, or their body failed them. If they ended up having an unplanned C-section or whatever it may be, ask about the birth. Does that make sense?
Can you speak to, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm taking you. Can you speak to how you work with clients and home visitors in that for many women who have those traumatic experiences during birth,
Mm-hmm.
how that then translates to getting care for their babies later and or getting care for themselves later, especially what I heard in working with home visitors around the state is especially when they're working with families who either live in poverty, who don't share the same culture as the providers, and they feel this judgment, and that judgment keeps them from care. So can you talk a little bit about how you work with home visitors or other providers to encourage that connection after that traumatic experience?
So how to like encourage them to get further services?
Yeah, because I think we see a lot of home visitors who come in, who they weren't part of that birthing process. But that traumatic experience
Mm-hmm.
makes it really difficult for parents to return for care.
Oh yeah.
And so how are we helping either do some of that healing or reconnecting? How can we support these families through those traumatic experiences so it
Right.
doesn't kind of lead towards deeper interventions?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the most important thing to do is to show up with curiosity and compassion, always. And so if someone is, resistant, it's because they have a protective part. And so, how can you be curious about that protective part? And so what is that protective part, protecting? Usually some sort of woundedness, some sort of like trauma or exile. And so honor that. And so a lot of times what practitioners do is they try and like push away or beat down that kind of resistance. And what I think is really important to do is honor the protective part, because it's doing a job, and the job is to protect the person. And so you can kind of just say, I'm noticing that there is a part of you that's feeling really, really worried about maybe me being here, about maybe, getting more care. Could you speak to that a little bit? Or I really get that. Doesn't really make sense to that part that you would go and get more help from people that were just pretty scary. So I think you just really honor the part that's really trying to protect the person and give it time. Does that make sense? So this is my wheelhouse, and I feel the most passionate about it because I think it's where most of us as a culture really mess up. Because as far as I've experienced, most of us really don't know how to talk about death and get utterly uncomfortable and say things to try and like and push away and so I think learning how to invite conversation and learning how, and so what I do with the people that I supervise is teach them how to pay attention to their discomfort and teach them how to sit in it and remind them that this moment is not about you. And so with pregnancy loss and stillbirth, so any sort of miscarriage, it's a loss that no one talks about. And so in the experience of a DNC or a DNE, which we don't have time to go into, but the constant wondering of who are they going to be, what were they going to look like, how old would they be now, what kind of big sister or big brother would they be, and helping them wonder really stuff that no one will be doing with them because everybody is uncomfortable about that. And so the fact that you would maybe do that with them would absolutely change their world. And then helping them understand that it's hard to learn how to grieve someone you never met. And no one else will know how to do that. but you can help them figure out how to do that together. And help them think about, how do you want to honor their memory? How do you want to create a space for them in this family? Because that can be something you can help them think about. This is something they hear all the time, and they'll continue to hear, particularly around miscarriage or stillbirth. You can always have another one. People are not replaceable. And what often happens, and you don't have to share, but if someone in here has had a miscarriage or a stillbirth, and even people who've been pregnant, it's from a lot of us, as soon as we found out we were pregnant, we were immediately imagining who that they were going to be. What was the first day of kindergarten going to be like? You know, launching them to college. Like, you created a person. And so when you experience a miscarriage, when that baby dies, it's not just like an embryo or whatever. It is a full person that you have created in your mind. The social constraint is the most maladaptive most salient identifier for maladaptive behavior and bereavement. So the sense of like, I can't talk about it. Like, I work with people all the time who are always, so obviously Thanksgiving just happened, and all the parents that I met with before Thanksgiving all worried about how making other people uncomfortable talking about their babies. That was the big concern. So I'm always asking people, how have other people treated you since your beloved died? Because that will help me know how they're doing. So this is what you tell, as supervisors, this is what you ask and make sure your people are doing. Are you saying their child's name? Are you remembering their birthday and their death day? Do you ask to see the pictures? It might be hard. It will be hard to see a picture of a stillborn baby. This is not about you. Be curious about the birth story. Be non-judgmental. When you need to, when you leave the home after looking at pictures of their stillborn baby, you say goodbye, and then you go into your car if you need to, and you cry and you call your supervisor. And then that's what you do. And then you take time for yourself and you do what you need to do. But in that moment, it's not about you. How are you going to show up for them? This is not, you probably wouldn't be at the hospital, I imagine. You will never remind a parent, because a lot of people say, like, oh, I just don't want to remind them of the person who died. You won't. They are always thinking about their child. You won't make them more sad. They will be grateful for the opportunity to talk about them or think about them. And there is no timeline for grief. One of the things that is the most frustrating, and this will be an important thing to kind of check in about as you're working with people, whenever I am working with someone who had a stillborn baby and they come back from their 6-week checkup and their doctor has given them antidepressants because they're depressed. No, they're grieving. Their baby just died. That is indicative of a culture that has no tolerance for grief. And so then they pathologize it, and the message given is like, I don't want to have to deal with this. It makes me uncomfortable. And so the message to the people who you supervise is, don't be uncomfortable. Be a place, be a sanctuary where they don't have to feel like they have to take care of you. Because everywhere else they go, they feel like they have to take care of the other person's feelings because no one is taking care of their feelings. I just really like that. Man dies of the cold, not of the darkness. The grief is the darkness. They can survive that, but they can't survive as the cold of other people.
To your point about medication, I think for some, that grief is too heavy, and so a temporary medication might be a solution for them. And so I think we have to also be open to the fact that that might be their journey, and that might be their grief. They might experience their grief in a different way at a different time. So I think it's important to acknowledge that that's what the parent chooses as a way to cope. That it's
So I would say two things to that. If a parent goes in to their 6-week appointment, they're generally not in a place yet to recognize what they need. Because everything is too much. And so I think, so I wouldn't agree with that statement. I don't think medication is bad. I am like a huge proponent of medication. I don't think we should medicate grief or pathologize grief.
I agree with that statement 100%. I think there's a lot of other needs that, sometimes they have multiple children that
Absolutely.
they have to figure out how to be present.
So then that's a great point. So how would you help them think through this or talk through this or feel their way through that?
Maybe a both and, or when they're ready, or I think it's a beautiful process that you're describing, and not everybody's ready for me to talk to them about it. It depends so much on the relationship.
Yeah.
And how long you've been with them and all of those kind of things. So I think it really obviously depends. I think being curious about it and then letting them lead is a really
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some moms that can't get themselves out of bed to take care of their baby. And it's hard to see that. I get your point. We never want to rush to medication, and yet there's a vulnerable baby here, which I think we don't need to pay attention to. Is it our discomfort, or is it actually what's happening in the diet?
Yeah.
I do think there are times in the diet that there's some extra help that's needed to get through it. What the timing is on that, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yes, I think your point to what is happening, like what's the context. But I think what is always most crucial as a practitioner is what's happening here. What is my agenda? What's being triggered? What is my level of discomfort? Because this isn't easy. And it's not easy to sit with, and it's like infant death in particular is really triggering. I mean, death in general is really triggering, but infant death, because it is so out of order, it's a traumatic grief, is really, really triggering for people. And so what's happening here? And I think that's always a really important thing. So am I wanting, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but like, am I wanting to encourage medication because I'm seeing the 3-year-old not being attended to, and now I'm starting to get really anxious because like the 3-year-old's not being attended to, they haven't gotten out of bed now, and like I'm starting to like get really nervous, you know, like there's all of that going on. And so supervision. That's when supervision is really important to figure out like what is about what's happening for you, what is clinically necessary, and then what needs to be like addressed with the parent. And that all is important to be talking about.
I want to comment on that too, though. I resonate with those things. What you are describing is a really beautiful process, but I think it's a privilege that some don't have. Be able to sit with that grief and to be able to have that. And I think even with home visitors, sometimes, you know, we only meet with them once a week or less than that. And they have other things going on, maybe they do have another child, maybe they have other services that they have to attend or things like that, to where we don't have the privilege to sit with them in their grief as often as this type of strategy would require. I get the point of it. I think it's really important to consider, but I think that sometimes the persons that we're working with, I think medication may be the most beneficial route for them because that's what they have time for, and they don't have the time to sit with them necessarily and be able to focus on aspects of sitting in their grief.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm curious
Can you
about,
summarize, I know they couldn't hear that on the phone, so can you just summarize kind of what she just,
Yeah.
concept?
so what was said is that what I'm describing seems like a bit of a privilege because there's often not time for this type of reflection and being in this type of grief because there's a lot of other things that may be going on. And that sometimes medication may be necessary because it's in there's other things that have to be attended to. Does that feel
Yeah.
good? And I think what I would say to that is this doesn't take an hour. I mean, to come in to a home visiting session and like sit down and, because yes, I mean, sometimes it's like there's chaos and, you know, what's up with your, housing stuff. I mean, there's just a lot going on. To take 2 to 3 minutes to say, how have you been feeling, or I'm wondering about what's been coming up for you lately about, losing your daughter. That's grief work. That's not really time intensive. What often happens is because of our discomfort, people stop talking about it. And so what I'm saying is this needs to be part of the work ongoing. I think what you're imagining, maybe, and I could be wrong, is like therapy. And you don't have time for that because there are like lots of fires you're putting out. But let's not leave this behind. So grief isn't a privilege. It is a huge part of who we are as human beings and needs to be attended to, and it often gets obscured because of discomfort. And I think it needs to be included always. And so to the point of medication, I think if there is an issue around functioning, that's a clinical issue, of course. And so you have a conversation with your client about that. I'm under no assumption that if it's between functioning and experiencing grief, that you would do this. I mean, you have to function, you have to take care of your kids, you have to maintain your housing, all of that. But we need to be mindful of why. Does that make sense?
And that image is very different than
Yes.
what you said
Yeah.
earlier. Yeah, it does.
Then I appreciate you helping me
Yeah.
get to
And
that.
that, to your point, that's where I was going, so.
Okay, thank you for helping me get to that then.
I'm not a direct service provider, I actually count money, so. But I am curious though, for home visitors, so how do you deal with this though, especially when you're taught to kind of departmentalize so you don't get too involved with your clients? How do you maintain that balance, and how do you protect yourself from triggers that you may have from dealing with? I'm just curious for people who are direct service providers, or what would you suggest that they do to protect themselves? Because I
Yes.
can imagine this would be triggering too. So, yeah.
And NFP, the model in and of itself does that, because every week you reflect with, and it's a reflective practice thing. So they talk through all those feeling things, how this affected, plus then we bring in a mental health consultant twice a month, again, going through that whole process. So we really build it into the model
Nice.
of understanding that's what you go through. So I think that's the
Yeah.
great thing about that model.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into what we were going to talk about next in 4 minutes.
Zelda, can I just, there was a question from Brittany about, and I think it ties well to this piece. If you have tools to help with postpartum depression, or a questionnaire or tools that you could recommend, that'd be great. So, but I'll let
Okay.
you do that,
Yeah.
and then we'll follow.
So parenting psychotherapy. So parenting evokes history and it follows history. So that means that if there's 2 unconscious roadmaps that parenting follows. And one is what it was like to be a child at the same age as your child. And then what it was like to be a parent at the same age as your parent at that time. And we unknowingly recreate our past and our present all the time. And we do what we had. Parenting reflects how it was for us, and it activates our history, both the things we remember and the things we do not. And so the thing that you're seeing all the time when you walk into the homes of the people that you're working with or that your supervisees are working with is what it was like for them. So this is what's happening. And we don't know that our experience is embedded in us, and that we've learned parenting through our experiences. And what I often tell the people that I work with is that, like, we become a parent and it's like a light switch goes on and all of our shit just shows up. And this is my favorite. Parenting is embarrassing because all of our stuff is now on the outside. Like, everyone can see it. All of this stuff is on the outside, and it shows up in how we're parenting all the time.
Especially at the grocery store or Target.
Yep.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, I had an incident last night with my daughter, and that exact phrase came to my mind. I was like, God, parenting is just embarrassing. So they tell us how they wish it was, but they show us how it was. This is a home visiting tip. So they'll sit down and they will talk to us about how they wish it was, how they wish it was in their family. But they're showing us all the time when they are saying, like, you know, shut the fuck up, or, you know, sit down, or no, you can't have that. And they're yelling, or they're spanking, or whatever it is. But then they might tell us a story of, you know, how great it was to grow up, or whatever it may be. But they are showing us all the time what it was like for them. And then they're going to recreate it. And we all do it. So attachment, regulation, protection, safety sets us up to be secure regulatory partners for someone dependent on us. However, if these needs are not met, we don't know how to regulate another person. And we don't know how to soothe someone else. And we also don't know if the thing that someone is asking of us, if those needs are legitimate. I think that is really, really helpful. Because when we see that in the folks that we're working with, when we see that they can't quite like soothe their kids or like pull them in close, or they don't know how to like put them to bed, it's because they don't know how to do what wasn't done for them. And they don't know that it's like a regular ask. They don't know. And so we help them by setting the frame. So that is what is important for you to help your people learn to do. You set the frame. This is what I'm doing all the time, is setting the frame. So setting the frame is, what was it like for you? Because what I always imagine is someone comes to us or you go to them in their home and you sit down and they pick up a box with a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces and they dump it out. And they say, here you go. This is everything. And you're like, oh, okay. Oh, that's a lot. And then you start helping them find the end pieces. You're helping them set the frame so that they can begin understanding what it was like for them, and then you slowly help them fill in the pieces. So setting the frame is, tell me about, what it was like for you growing up. And then you'll say, oh, that sounds really hard. And then, so tell me, how's it been going so far? Okay, and then you start to pick up these pieces. You can start putting them into the puzzle and filling in. And it sounds like it's not going the way you thought it would. And they may say things like, I want to beat her ass. Okay, yeah. Thoughts are not the deed. That sounds like you are utterly overwhelmed. And then I know we're like out of time. I was going to talk about the protective shield. There's so much to talk about. And then they tell you what they want, and they show you how it is. And the work that you're doing is how to get these things to get closer. Okay? So they will say things like, I just want to what's something that one of the people, like a family that you work with, might say they want? Like a goal.
School housing, it can be down to just basic housing goals. It can be
Yep.
work, it can be
Yep.
relationships, it can be multiple things.
Yeah, and then they show you how it is by it's really hard to maintain housing. And so then the work is getting those things close. That's the work. So what are the things that get in the way of maintaining housing? And you go back to the frame. So what was it like in the past that got in the way of keeping housing? What do you know about that? Understanding the impact of past on the present. And then helping people use their adult capabilities to understand situations in which their child mind made the conclusion. So that's the thing I'll end on, because we're out of time. But what happens is that people come to us, or you go to people, and they have made conclusions about things that are happening in their lives with their child minds, with their traumatized minds of what they understood when they were little. And then you help them by sharing your mind to understand, like, no, that sounds really hard, but I'm wondering if maybe we can think about that a little bit differently. So for example, like you might work with someone who thinks, their kid, just doesn't like them. They're just
The
like,
2-year-olds
Yep.
trying to manipulate.
yep, perfect, that's it.
Like they are people.
Yep.
With manipulation.
Yeah. And so then you help them use their adult capabilities. Because the thing is what that shows you is that someone said that to them, and that's a conclusion that their little mind made. And so you help them use their adult mind. So let's think about that. I'm wondering about if, how you came to that conclusion, how you came to understand your little, you help them begin to use their adult minds around how they came to that conclusion. Because we are just helping them come out of that traumatized state. I'm so sorry I didn't get through all this. This was more of a marathon than a sprint.
I think it's a nice space to end as far as the idea that as a home visitor, we're really working with families to help them bring their own experiences of parenting that they did feel were helpful or supportive of them, and what they're showing and bringing those two things together. I think it's really helpful.
Yes.
Thinking about that and
Well,
helping us
yeah.
support them through. You can't, in once a week, you can't make those changes. You can help guide and support those changes. So.
Yeah.
I think Brittany was looking for resources. I had a chance to look online. If you scroll down, Brittany, there's a postpartum
Yep.
.net. And then I'll talk with Delta about whether or not there's actually a questionnaire or resource. But
Yeah, I have a resource page on the back or on the last page.
So they are available on our website. So if you go to the front page of our website, there's a meeting folder that has all of Delta's slides on there, and you can download those. So I know some of you have to leave, so I want to just say thank you to everybody for being here and staying a little bit late. And